Coming back to liability and limiting your liability, I said we'd focus on that a little bit more on this slide. And so that's what this is. Essentially, when we're talking about liability and limiting liability, we're just talking about risk. We're talking about the things that could go wrong. We're talking about things that could go wrong on purpose, or things that could go wrong that are not within our control, mistakes people have made, things that get damaged, whether they be reputation or whether they be physical things, property damage, and just generally things going awry. So when you enter into a business relationship with another party, there will be various risks that need to be thought through and then allocated. And often, in allocating those risks, you will both be thinking about what kind of risks are likely to happen, what risks are not likely to happen, who's best positioned to insure for those risks, to cover those risks, to preempt the risks happening in the first place, what kind of money might be involved in certain kind of risks. So it's really a risk assessment that gets undertaken between the parties. But of course, from your point of view, you want to make sure that they carry as much risk as possible and you carry as little risk as possible. And that's really what these clauses boil down to, is sharing that risk. How do you, on your side, keep your risk as low as possible? With the total exclusions box, we're talking about essentially putting a ceiling on the risk you're willing to take on and saying, above this figure, £10,000, £100,000, £500,000, I am not going to take on any further risk. I'm not going to pay out any more than that in aggregate or per incident of things going wrong. That's simply my cap. So if you hear people talking about cap, they're just really talking about a ceiling. And where that lies will depend on all those things we just talked about. What's reasonable for the cap to be, the nature of the relationship, the kind of contract, the risks involved. And often those things will be tied to the insurance that's involved. But there may be an industry standard. It may be quite common for people to see the same kinds of figures turning up again and again in contracts. And this may actually be a conversation that you can have with your insurers or people in the industry. What kind of levels of risk should I take on here would be reasonable, are kind of the norm. So it's not a completely random process where you're all alone trying to figure out where it may be. There are some reference points out there. There's a lot of people who may be able to help you, business people who have gone through a lot of contracts and negotiated these levels. So ask around if you're confused about where your levels of risk should lie. Implied terms. Is everyone familiar with implied terms? Implied terms are essentially parts of the agreement, provisions in the agreement that aren't there in words. They're implied, usually by law, for example. And so that means you can't do things and you should do certain things based on the law rather than what's in contracts. And to a certain extent, you can exclude those implied terms. There's some things you can't exclude in law. You can't, when we're talking about liability, you can't exclude your responsibility for injury or death caused by your own negligence, for example. But there are certain things you can exclude, and in particular, implied terms. You can say very basically, I exclude all implied terms to the extent that the law allows, something along those lines, and that will potentially reduce your liability quite a lot. With the remedies, obviously, if you have certain obligations that you need to perform when something goes wrong, you're obliged to perform extra staff. Maybe you're a car hire company. You're obliged to provide, top-end cars. You're obliged to provide a driver with those cars. You're obviously going to want to reduce the obligations. So instead of providing, a limousine with a driver, all you're going to do is offer a Pinto. So the obligations, the scope of the obligations, you're going to want to narrow as much as possible, and you'll do that in writing in the contract. I also said we'd look at termination because it's quite a probably crucial one. The moral generally is that when you go into a contract, when you enter a contract, make sure you're thinking as much about exiting the contract as entering the contract. Contracts can often start with a lot of backslapping and smiles and optimism and hopes and dreams, but all relationships come to an end, as one lecturer once told me, and that includes commercial agreements. And it's really important to think about how you get out of those agreements with minimum fuss, trial, tribulation, and cost to you. Some of the triggers for termination, we'll just skim over these, include obviously when the thing expires, it will automatically come to an end when the contract comes to an end, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line. You'll see the term termination for convenience. Quite often, it just means we can end the contract whenever we feel like it. Usually, there'll be a notice requirement saying we, party A, can end the contract on 30 days' notice. But we don't need any other reasons. You don't need to have breached. It's just because we feel like it. Something's changed for us, and that's that. Obviously, you'll want to make sure that if the other side may be about to go bust, that you can terminate your arrangements with them. So you'll see quite commonly termination for insolvency provisions in there. Change of control, the same principle we talked about earlier on. You don't necessarily want the party you're doing business with becoming your direct competitor, and you want perhaps the right to terminate the arrangement if there is a change of control on the other side. Persistent breach if the other side is doing something that wouldn't be a reason to end the contract, but because they do it again and again and again, it's making your life very difficult. It's making it hard for you to perform your obligations and for you to deliver what you need to deliver from the contract. Probably most important is material breach. Material breach is not the same thing as a repudiatory breach. A repudiatory breach might be someone just simply stops performing their side of the bargain, whereas a material breach means it's an important breach. But if you want that material breach to be a trigger for you to be able to terminate the contract, you need to spell it out. So be very clear, if you do this, if you do that, if you do this, these will be material breaches, and all of them will give us the right to terminate this contract, usually on some sort of written notice. And usually, you want to use termination rights as a sort of sword of Damocles hanging over the other party. You don't want to terminate a lot of the time, you just want them to perform their side of the bargain. So it's great to have really strong termination rights in there, but as important to build in or look for remediation provisions so that while you're in dispute, you can say, look, if you don't remediate according to our remediation agreements, provisions in the contract or a separate remediation plan, if you don't comply with those provisions, then we'll terminate at great cost to you. But really what you want them to do is just remediate. So make sure those two things go together, the termination provisions and remediation provisions. And then finally, we'll just end on a final slide here. Just skip over some of the common contract mistakes people make. Really, the first one is just something to bear in mind, that prevention is the best cure. And that really is true in contracts. The more detailed a contract can be, the more you've thought through the risks and who will do what happens if things go wrong, how will you respond to delays, etc. If that is all in the contract, it really helps problems down the line and potentially prevent you from ending up spending a fortune in court. Before you even enter the contract's a bit like a marriage. You know, you're going to be stuck with these people for potentially a long time, and you want to make sure you know who you're getting into bed with. You want to make sure you understand a bit about their business, a bit about the personalities, a bit about the way they work, the reputation in the market. So I think generally due diligence about the partners in a commercial agreement is a really important part of understanding what arrangement you're entering. A quick fly the flag for terms and conditions. Terms, the standard terms of business, are often overlooked as being something that someone sort of pulls off Google and sticks in the back of their web page or puts on the shelf and forgets about. Terms, the standard terms for a business are absolutely vital, and perhaps one of the most important things you can invest in as a small business, really of any size, because they do a number of things all in one go. They provide certainty about what you are willing to do and what you are not willing to do, what your liability is, what you'll do when things go wrong. They manage expectations with the other side. They give you something you can take into court and enforce. they provide that all-important clarity when often you most need it. So if you don't have terms of business, or if you haven't updated your terms of business, or don't really use them, or really you're not familiar with them, I would say revisit those because they're a really vital part of your business. And I suppose in conclusion, I would say that you should always just take a step back and understand, before you enter into a commercial contract, what you're trying to achieve. What's the point in this contract? It's a fairly fundamental question, but a really important one. And ask yourself, is it doing fundamentally what we need it to do? Or is it getting us sidetracked? Is it trying to do more than we need to do? Is it doing enough? Are the people that we're agreeing to enter this contract with the right people? In the negotiation phase, during the contract negotiation phase, what kinds of people have they shown themselves to be? Are they kinds of people we want to work with for the next 2, 3, 4 years? So once you've gone through some of the detail of the contract, you've looked at the priorities, you've really understood your risk exposure, how you're going to terminate the agreement, etc., etc. Step back, have a look at the agreement as a whole, have a look at the people on the other side, and really understand, are these the kind of people that I want to sign off this piece of paper with? So, bit of a general overview. I hope it was useful. So I'll hand over to James at this point.